Hi, and welcome back to our next module. This module in particular, we're going to be exploring some other concepts of Socrates and Plato through one of Socrates' dialogue, in particular with Meno. So this is going to be an interesting way of approaching concepts. You might be used to learning from a textbook. In these instances, you'll have dialogues. So Plato's the author of all of Socrates' works. Remember, we talked about in the last module the Socratic problem. Did Socrates actually exist or not? Plato is not a character in any of these dialogues. He uses really these conversations to explain a concept. And that's one of the important things to remember, is that the whole point of reading these conversations between Socrates and other individuals are less about learning the conversation or remembering details of the conversation so much as what's the point that Socrates is trying to get across and what's the method that he uses. Those are going to be the most important things. The conversations are really just ways to get concepts across. So in this particular conversation, it's one of five Socratic dialogues that Plato writes. It's between Socrates and an individual named Meno. This is back in ancient Greek, so a lot of the names are going to be different and interesting, so just bear with me. We don't really know anything about Meno. He kind of just shows up. Literally, the dialogue just starts like Meno asking a question. There's no context, there's no background, just starts with a question. And one of the reasons for that is Meno is from this aristocratic family in the ancient Greek city of Thessaly. He's looking to fulfill the stereotypical Greek career trajectory for a Greek man of honor, military pursuits, political careers, seeking virtue and honor, things that were essential to a Greek successful man. And he approaches Socrates, probably because he's heard of Socrates, thinks he's a wise man, and attributes him to this movement of individuals called the Sophists. So the Sophists were these essentially philosophers, these orators, speakers, who would speak on wisdom, on knowledge, on different concepts. Oftentimes they would be paid by individuals to teach them. So Meno probably looks at Socrates like one of these teachers, so to speak, these orators. And he asks him a simple question: what is virtue? And that question is going to be the whole dialogue to set up the real point of this conversation, which is Plato, the author, trying to show us the quest for knowledge and this idea of recollection of knowledge. So the characters in this conversation there's four of them. There's Meno, who's the main individual who starts the conversation. There's Socrates, so really the vast majority of the conversation is between Meno and Socrates. And Socrates has his own interesting way of speaking. He has his quirks. He kind of throws some sarcasm in there from time to time, so just bear with him. Then you have this individual, Anytus. He really just shows up real briefly, and the whole point of his presence in the conversation is he's kind of annoyed, doesn't like Socrates. So Socrates represents the philosopher. Remember the cave, the quest for knowledge, the quest to get out of the cave and encounter a new reality, the quest for wisdom. Anytus is basically trying to convince Meno that Socrates has nothing to offer and to not listen to him, that he's wrong. So Anytus really symbolizes the status quo. Don't seek knowledge, new wisdom, just kind of stay where you are. Then you have Meno's slave. Now, the whole point of Meno's slave in the conversation is to depict this concept of the theory of recollection. That similar to the theory of forms, that there's these original forms by which we can know all things. So if we see something beautiful in the world, it's really us tapping into the ultimate form of beauty. Similar thing with theory of recollection, that there's this theoretical knowledge that we can all tap into if we ask the right questions. So he uses this mathematical equation by asking questions of Meno to try to solve this mathematical equation, knowing Meno's slave doesn't know math, to prove this theory. So that's the point of Meno's slave being in this dialogue. That portion of dialogue is not included in your reading, mainly because it's a series of mathematical questions to just prove the one point I just told you. So you're welcome. So here's the main idea of this whole dialogue. So Meno poses a question, and you're going to notice we're going to talk next module a lot about the Socratic method. It's all about questions and using questions as a means to draw out new information to lead someone to a conclusion. And so Meno poses a question, can virtue be taught? Now, why do we care about virtue? Because virtue is very important to ancient Greek, especially to this idea of the Greek man, of seeking being a virtuous man, being an honorable man. And really, Socrates is really not interested in discovering what virtue is so much as he wants to get Meno to think about knowledge. How do we seek knowledge? And can we understand the difference between what is teachable and what is not? And so the question of virtue is simply used by Socrates as a way to show Meno how to search for knowledge. How do we learn things? And that's really the aim of the Socratic method. You're going to see him using it here, where it's basically he asks a question. He might pose a hypothesis to start the conversation. A what if question. Well, what if Meno this was true? And Meno will answer. And then based on that, he will build on Meno's responses to get him to really what the answer Socrates wants to be. Again, we're going to explore the Socratic method in a different module. But just so you get the premise, that's how all his conversations go. So he makes Meno make one point, he makes Meno make another point. And so he says, well, Meno, if your first point is true and your second point is true, then obviously this third point must be true. And that third point is really what Socrates is going for. So the key things to know about this dialogue is that really it shows how Socrates uses hypotheses to seek knowledge. Well, what if Meno this is true? And then let's try to prove that hypothesis. And that's how we'll get to our point. His big point is the recollection of theoretical knowledge. So just like there's the ultimate forms, there's this theoretical knowledge, this ultimate knowledge, so to speak, that we all can tap. If we're asked the right questions, we're all born with it, so to, in a lack of a better term. And so we just need to be able to get there through the right questioning. We can tap this theoretical knowledge. And that we need to move from what I might refer to as perspective or opinion to ultimate knowledge, that we can get bogged down in different opinions, but really if we draw what is true across various opinions, we can actually seek ultimate knowledge. And that while opinions change, knowledge always remains. So there's this big differentiation between opinions that are constantly changing and knowledge. Maybe you can equate it with the term truth, that is always the same. Opinions might lead to truth, but they're not the same. Opinions change, knowledge stays the same. So the use of hypothesis. So Socrates uses what-if questioning to try to help Meno understand what a concept actually is. So, for example, if you look at the dialogue of Meno, if you look at pages 60 and 61, right after he asks Socrates, "Can virtue be taught?" That's the question. And so Socrates basically asks him, what is virtue about virtue? So I'm going to read part of the dialogue. So Meno will say, well, it's not hard to tell you, Socrates. First, if you want the virtue of a man, it's easy to say that a man's virtue consists of being able to manage public affairs, and in so doing to benefit his friends and harm his enemies, and to be careful that no harm comes to himself. If you want the virtue of a woman, it's not difficult to describe. She must manage the home well, preserve its possessions, and be submissive to her husband. The virtue of a child, whether male or female, is different again, and so is that of an elderly man. If you want that, or if you want that of a free man or a slave, and there are very many other virtues, so that one is not at a loss to say what virtue is. There is virtue for every action in every age, for every task of ours and every one of us, and Socrates, the same is true for wickedness. So a little caveat here. This is written in ancient Greek. There's a different culture here that obviously we no longer live in, where certainly women are not submissive to their husbands. So you have to kind of read this knowing this is the time which they lived in. So he basically goes on to describe, virtue is different. Maybe it may look different for men and women. And Socrates he quips, he makes a joke, he says, I seem to be in great luck, Meno. While I'm looking for one virtue, I found you have a whole swarm of them. So it's basically his way of joking with Meno, but he basically wants Meno to say, all right, you have all these different perspectives on virtue. That's not knowledge. That's not what virtue actually is. So how can you use these perspectives you just shared to try to get to what virtue is? So he uses this example of bees and the swarm of bees and use it as an example to the Socratic method to question Meno on this idea of virtue. Uh, and basically says, if I were asking you what the nature of bees is, and you said that there are many and all kinds, just like he said all the different things about virtue. He asked him, do you mean that they are many and varied and different from one another insofar as they are bees? Or are they no different in that regard, but in the same other respect, in their beauty, for example, their size, or in some other such way? Meno says, I would say that they do not differ from one another in being bees. If I went on to say, Socrates says, tell me what is this very thing, Meno, in which they are all the same and do not differ from one another? Would you be able to tell me? Meno says, I would. Socrates says, the same is true in the case of virtues. Basically what he's getting at is, just like he gives these examples of, well, if you say the bees are all different, but there's one thing that's the same across all of them. Can you identify? Yeah, well, they might all be bigger sizes or have different sized wings, but you can tell that they're all bees. There's something that unites all the bees together. It's bee-ness, so to speak. In a similar way with virtue, he goes, think, you said all these examples of different virtue, but could you identify what virtue is in its very basic way? And Meno says, yes. And he says, that's what we're looking for. That's how you can take a piece, for instance, take perspectives of one concept like virtue and put them together to understand what virtue actually is. And so he's going to use this method of asking these questions throughout. And he's essentially going to pose a hypothesis on what virtue is, but he's not going to do it till page 79. And he's going to say, he's going to talk about, in that main kind of paragraph there, he's going to put forward this hypothesis that basically, if it's going to talk, so by using this hypothesis, I'm willing to tell you what results with regard to inscribing in the circle, that is, whether it is impossible or not. So here's what I was looking for. So let us speak about virtue also, since we do not know either what it is or what qualities it possesses, and let us investigate whether it is teachable or not by means of a hypothesis. And say this: among the things existing in the soul of what sort is virtue, that it should be teachable or not. First, if it is another sort than knowledge, is it teachable or not? Or, as we were just saying, recollectable? Let it make no difference to us which term we use. Is it teachable, or is it plain to anyone that men cannot be taught anything but knowledge? So basically, to answer Meno's original question of whether or not a virtue is teachable, he throws a hypothesis before it. Let's try to answer the question of, well, is it teachable? That's our hypothesis. And first, if it's knowledgeable, it's the teachable kind. And if it's not teachable, is it the recollectable kind? So let's talk a little about this idea of recollectable. So Socrates points to this notion of the soul. Remember the tripartite soul that's immortal? There's a part of the immortal soul that is the rational piece of it. That Socrates believes that the reason in the soul allows us to tap into this theoretical knowledge that has always existed prior to our birth. It's the idea of the theory of forms. Remember, the ultimate form of beauty, if you experience something beautiful, it's really that you're tapping into the form of beauty, and you're able to know that something is beautiful because this ultimate form of beauty exists. Without that, no one would actually know what beauty is. It's all subjective. But there's this ultimate sense of, all right, beauty exists because the ultimate form of beauty exists. So in a similar way, there's certain knowledge that is unteachable. We are just born with it. It is, and we can recollect it by asking these questions. So Socrates hypothesizes that by engaging in the right questioning, a person can be triggered to recollect this theoretical knowledge they have since birth. That is the whole questioning of Meno's slave. He basically says, all right, well, Meno's slave doesn't know anything of math. Remember, the Pythagoras school was pre-Socratic and using mathematics and numbers sacred to understand existence. So he says, all right, well, Meno's slave doesn't know anything of math. I'm just going to ask him these leading questions, and he's naturally going to be able to get to the conclusion on his own. He says, watch this. And so he asks him these questions about a geometry problem. And really what he's trying to prove to Meno is and Meno's slave ultimately reaches a conclusion really led by Socrates. Socrates kind of has a lot of leading questions that leads Meno right to the answer, you could argue. However, the whole point is that, all right, see, Meno's slave doesn't know math. Just by asking the right dialectic questions, he can tap into he has a theoretical knowledge of math that he was born with. He just needs to recollect it. And that's the whole point, that there's some knowledge, some ultimate knowledge, theoretical knowledge that has always existed in the universe, that's a part of who we are. That's kind of part of what Socrates is getting at. And that really, just like I just explained with the perspectives on virtue, that we need, if we're able to, we have all these different perspectives on something. Let's find out what is congruent across all the different perspectives, and we can ultimately get to the ultimate theoretical knowledge or form of virtue. So we have to move from what we think something is to discovering its reality. And the reality it really points to the existence of truth and meaning in the world. So another example might be, I might talk about me having a good day. You might talk about having a good day. And our versions of a good day are going to be different. But that we both have an understanding that such a thing as a good day exists means that there is such a thing as a good day. That your perspective and my perspective on a good day, while different, point to an ultimate reality of a good day, if that makes sense. So in a similar way, when he was questioning Meno about virtue, again, remember what I read. Meno talks about the virtues of men, the virtues of women, the virtues of children, what I call the shadows of virtue, these kind of tastes of the ultimate form, the tastes of the ultimate theoretical knowledge of virtue. But really, he's not talking about what virtue ultimately is. He's just listing different things about virtue and attributing them to different states in life. Socrates basically gets him to see, you're not defining virtue, you're talking about these different aspects of virtue. But conversely, if you take all the different aspects, you take the different perspectives, and you look at them, there's one thing that's true across all of them. And that is ultimately, in part, what virtue might be. Now, for Socrates, that's ultimately unknowable to a certain degree. But his whole point is getting him to realize that if we look at the different perspectives we have on an item, that we can get to the ultimate knowledge. The tricky part is going to be, he believes certain knowledge is teachable and certain knowledge is not. So in all his conversations with Meno, we start to understand there's a difference between opinion and knowledge. And really for Socrates, for something to be true knowledge, it has to be teachable. That way, if it's teachable, it means it can be known, it can be understood. So I understand this is going to sound very similar to an opinion. Someone might be able to explain what their opinion is and be able to communicate it to you. But I want you to think in terms of Socrates' dialogue with Meno, and this understanding maybe instead of using the words opinion and knowledge, maybe think about perspective and truth. So remember that perspective is not ultimately truth, because you can see a portion of the truth of this ultimate piece of reality. Think of the cave, right? You only have a certain perspective of the horse in the cave. But ultimately, if you're able to leave the shackles, leave that place in the cave, you can see what the horse actually is. So maybe think about it in terms of perspective and truth. And so by testing our perspectives, joining them together, seeing what's knowable throughout the perspectives, and that can be quantifiable, that quantifiable piece, that understandable piece, that can be taught to someone, right? Opinions can get confusing because they can just be based on us, not something that's quantifiable, understandable, teachable. That for Socrates would actually be knowledge. Another example why he differentiates between opinion and knowledge is someone could have an opinion and be wrong, and someone could have an opinion and be right, but not know why they're right. So have you ever had that happen to you where you've held something to be true about an idea, you never knew why, and then you found out you were right? And so this is Socrates' point about why opinion isn't knowledge, because when you have knowledge, you know that it's right and why it's right. You might have an opinion that's correct, but it could just be because you were lucky. And of all the different options you could have chosen and the opinions you could have formed, and on the very little perspectives that you had, it could be that you were correct in that piece of knowledge. But because it wasn't truly knowable and teachable to Socrates, he's not going to consider it knowledge. So ultimately, understanding why something is correct or true makes it knowledge if it's teachable. And so the big point of all of it, of what I'm discussing here is this: we have to search, we have to test. So we move from putting forward a hypothesis. Well, what if virtue is teachable? All right, let's start there. Now let's ask questions to try to figure out whether or not virtue is teachable. And by asking those questions, seeking for that knowledge, information that is testable, and testing that knowledge, information that is teachable, and testing that knowledge, we can reach that ultimate truth. So again, this is all goes back to Socrates' allegory of the cave. You have a perspective in the cave. If you can, like a good philosopher, ask questions, then you're taking off your shackles in the cave, you're moving past the fire, you're going out of the cave and into the real world, and you're ascending to truth. And it's the same thing with that theory of forms. In many ways, that theoretical knowledge can be equated to the forms. There's this ultimate knowledge, this ultimate truth. It's different than opinions, it's different than perspectives, but perspectives, when tested against a hypothesis, when you ask the right questions, when you test that knowledge, you can, by testing and testing and testing, reach that ultimate form, reach, by asking the right questions, reach that theoretical knowledge. So what does Socrates basically ultimately conclude here? Well, he really deems that virtue is neither an opinion nor brought by nature nor knowledge, because he doesn't believe virtue can be taught. And we see that at the conclusion of his dialogue on pages 90 to 92 in this last piece of it. He basically says, well, he doesn't believe that virtue can be taught. Ultimately, Socrates sees virtue as a divine gift that's connected to the immortal soul. So it's like a big bust, right? You're reading this whole thing, trying to understand, is virtue knowledge? Is virtue teachable? That's the whole point of all these pages of conversation. Again, what's the point of these dialogues? It's not to answer the original question. It's really to teach it a concept. And the concept we're trying to teach here is the recollection of knowledge. That by asking the right questions in the right order, you can tap into this theoretical knowledge that we have before, that we received before birth, that exists within the universe, that points to the idea that these ultimate truths, these ultimate forms, that when we're able to test knowledge and perspectives, we're able to get to. That's really the whole point of Socrates' philosophy in this conversation with Meno. But to answer Meno's question, he believes virtue is a divine gift. And in short, everything the human spirit undertakes or suffers, what a person experienced in the lived search for knowledge, will lead to happiness if it's guided by wisdom, or will lead to folly if not. So again, our whole lives, everything that we do, everything that we experience can be used to gain knowledge. It can be used to seek the forms, the ultimate truth. It can be used to um, understand existence by understanding the forms, according to Socrates. And if it's guided by wisdom, we'll experience happiness. And if it's not, then that to him, it's we're going to lead an unhappy life. But again, the main point, if you take nothing else away from the conversation with Meno, is in Socrates' mind and his belief, there is this theoretical knowledge we're all born with. Any of us can tap that knowledge by asking the right series of questions and to recollect that knowledge. And that knowledge, when it's tested and that different perspectives are brought together and are tested through hypotheses, we can chip away and build knowledge upon knowledge. And in doing so, that's how we seek truth. That's how we get to the ultimate forms that he believes guides existence. So that's Socrates' conversation on Meno. Now you can turn to your assignments, and we'll see you next week.